Knowledge Products presents The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. On May 6, 1527, Rome was devastated by an invading army, bringing to an end the greatest period in Italy's history, the Renaissance, a brilliant flowering of learning, art, and culture unrivaled in modern times. The Italy of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, the Italy of the rich city-states of Venice, Florence, and Milan, stood at the brink of ruin. Renaissance Italy was the casualty of decades of ferocious wars and invasions, as the monarchs of France and Spain, along with countless petty tyrants, competed for its wealth and magnificent treasures. Beginning with the French invasion of 1494, Italy had been plundered and devastated. And now, in 1527, barely 3 decades later, the final blow was struck, the sack of Rome herself, the Eternal City and center of the Catholic faith. An observer, Francesco Guicciardini, succinctly described this terrible year.
The year 1527 was full of atrocities and events unheard of for many centuries. Overthrow of governments, wickedness of princes, most frightful sacks of cities, great famines, a most terrible plague almost everywhere in Italy. Everything full of death, flight, and rapine.
As Pope Clement VII looked out the windows of the Vatican, he could see 20,000 soldiers descending on Rome, mainly German and Spanish mercenaries raised by Emperor Charles V for his conquest of Italy. Turned back at Florence, this horde marched to Rome, hungry and tired and impatient for the rich booty promised in exchange for their exhausting labor of murder and rape. Pope Clement VII, unable to raise sufficient money to buy off these mercenaries, the usual method of forestalling a city's devastation, had little hope that Rome's 4,000 defenders could turn back an army 5 times their size. An hour before sunset, the mercenaries broke through the walls of Rome and went about their work. Guicciardini described the havoc.
As soon as they had entered the city, they began to run about tumultuously in search of booty, respecting neither friends, nor the authority and dignity of prelates, nor even churches, monasteries, and relics honored by pilgrims from all over the world, nor sacred things. And to bring misery and infamy to overflowing, many prelates were captured by the soldiers, especially by the Germans, who because of their hatred for the Roman Church were cruel and insolent, contemptuously leading priests throughout the city of Rome mounted on asses and mules wearing the robes and insignia of their ecclesiastical dignity. Many were most cruelly tormented and either died in the torture or were treated in such a way that their lives ended within a few days after they had paid their ransom. About 4,000 men perished in the battle and in the furor of the sack.
As the mercenaries swarmed through Rome, they murdered indiscriminately. They slaughtered hospital patients and people seeking sanctuary in St. Peter's. Parents were forced to watch as their children were thrown out of windows. Only those of possible service to the mercenaries could hope to save their lives. The rich, who might offer ransom, and the young women, who might continue to amuse. Many of these desperate women, nuns included, sought their own kind of eternal sanctuary by leaping into the Tiber River. Rome, a cultural center that depended on daily deliveries of food and firewood from surrounding areas, ran out of supplies in a few days. So starvation and sickness joined the mercenaries in decimating the population. The sack continued for 8 days, but the marauders remained for 7 months to complete their destruction in a more leisurely fashion. Books and manuscripts went up in flames, and irreplaceable works of art were melted down for their precious metals. An eyewitness described the carnage.
The rich shops of the merchants are turned into stables. The most splendid palaces are stripped bare. Many houses are burnt to the ground. In others, the doors and windows are broken and carried away. The streets are changed into dunghills. The stench of dead bodies is terrible. Men and beasts have a common grave. And in the churches, I have seen corpses that dogs have gnawed.
When the army of looters, murderers, and rapists entered Rome, they entered a beautiful, thriving city. When they left 7 months later, fleeing the plague that inevitably descended on the filth-ridden remains, they left behind a lifeless shell. What took centuries to produce took only months to destroy. From the height of her splendor in the 15th century, Italy for the next 3 centuries would be a pawn in the ruthless game of power politics. The year 1527, which saw the death of Italy's Rome, also saw the death of Italy's greatest political theorist, Niccolo Machiavelli. A citizen of Florence, Machiavelli had become a government official of this city-state in 1498, and soon was undertaking diplomatic missions. This career lasted 14 years, until the Republican government Machiavelli served was replaced by the powerful Medici family, a dynasty that had ruled Florence for much of the previous century. Machiavelli, a longtime opponent of the Medicis, was dismissed from his post. Then, implicated in a plot to overthrow the ruling family, he was tortured on the rack to elicit a confession. After his release, Machiavelli retired to his villa outside Florence. But retirement did not suit the nervous and energetic Machiavelli. He was a political animal who longed to return to the political arena. Machiavelli, as he indicated in a letter to a friend, could not stop thinking and writing about politics.
If you have grown sick of discussing public affairs because you see things turn out quite differently from anything you had thought of and imagined, you have cause for it. The same thing has happened to me. Yet, if I were to speak with you, you couldn't keep me from filling your head with castles in Spain, because fortune has decreed that since I cannot discuss silk making or wool manufacture or profits and losses, I have to discuss matters of state. I must either make a vow of silence or talk about that subject.
Machiavelli loved his job with the Florentine government, and he wanted it back. He wasn't picky, however. He would take any job his former enemies, the Medicis, cared to offer. The Medicis weren't interested, so Machiavelli tried to impress them with an unsolicited piece of political advice. In 1513, he wrote a short manuscript on how a ruler can achieve and maintain power, dedicating it to the ruler of Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici. Later entitled The Prince, this manuscript was largely ignored during Machiavelli's lifetime. In fact, it was not even published until after his death. But The Prince would later emerge as the most important political work written during the Renaissance, and as one of the most influential political works ever written. The lasting fame of The Prince would have surprised Machiavelli. His first love was living politics, not writing about it, and were it not for his forced retirement, The Prince may never have been written at all. Barred from participating in the fast-paced political world of his beloved Florence, Machiavelli retired to the world of books and ideas.
In the evening, I return to my house and go into my study. At the door, I take off my clothes I have worn all day, mud-spotted and dirty, and put on regal and courtly garments, thus appropriately clothed. I enter into the ancient courts of ancient men, where, being lovingly received, I feed on that food which alone is mine, and which I was born for. I am not ashamed to speak with them, and to ask the reasons for their actions, and they courteously answer me. For 4 hours I feel no boredom, and forget every worry. I do not fear poverty, and death does not terrify me. I give myself completely over to the ancients. And because Dante says that there is no knowledge unless one retains what one has read, I have written down the profit I have gained from their conversation, and composed a little book, The Prince, in which I go as deep as I can into reflections on this subject, debating what a principality is, what the species are, how they are gained, how they are kept, and why they are lost.
As this letter indicates, Machiavelli did not tailor his writing to curry favor with the Medicis. He was not that kind of man. He wrote what he sincerely believed, and he thought his advice, based on years of practical experience, would demonstrate his political wisdom to the ruler of Florence. The prince also had another, more important purpose: to counsel the Medicis on how to save Italy from the ravages of foreign invaders, the barbarians, as Machiavelli and other Italians called them. Machiavelli, writing in 1513, could scarcely foresee the sack of Rome 14 years later, but he believed Italy was in serious trouble, lacking the means to save herself. What Italy needed, Machiavelli argued, was a strong leader, a prince with resolute determination to do whatever was necessary to repel the barbarians. And the House of Medici, Machiavelli humbly suggested, just might contain the prince Italy needed.
Italy remains without life, and awaits the man, whoever he may be, who is to heal her wounds, put an end to the plundering of Lombardy and the tribute laid on Tuscany and the Kingdom of Naples, and cure her of those sores that have long been suppurating. She may be seen praying God to send someone to redeem her from these cruel and barbarous insults. She is evidently ready and willing to follow a banner, if only someone will raise it. Nor is there at present anyone to be seen in whom she can put more hope than in your illustrious house, because its fortune and vigor, and the favor of God and the Church, which it now governs, enable it to be the leader in such redemption.
This passage indicates why Machiavelli regarded the Medici family, more than any other rulers in Italy, as especially well suited to lead Italy against the barbarians. The Medici family, he says, in addition to ruling Florence, also governed the Church. This refers to the Medici Pope, Leo X, who, like other pontiffs of his day, exercised considerable political and military clout. With the same family in control of Florence and the papacy, Machiavelli saw an ideal opportunity for the Medicis to unite a divided Italy against foreign domination. A similar opportunity had not arisen since the notorious Cesare Borgia, son of the Borgia Pope Alexander VI, had nearly succeeded in uniting various states in central Italy under the papacy. This is why Machiavelli analyzes and praises the policies of Alexander VI and Cesare Borgia in The Prince. The Medici family could learn some lessons from the Borgia family. After his call for a Medici prince to redeem Italy, Machiavelli adds that saving Italy should not be very difficult, provided the prince follows the advice he offers. Here, Machiavelli, praised by later generations as the most realistic of political writers, is unrealistic to an astonishing degree. But Machiavelli persists in his delusion. He ends The Prince with another call for a redeemer, a strong ruler who will lead Italy against the barbarians.
This opportunity, then, should not be allowed to pass, in order that after so long a time Italy may see her Redeemer. I am unable to express with what love he would be received in all the provinces that have suffered from these foreign deluges, with what thirst for vengeance, what firm faith, what piety, what tears. What gates would be shut against him? What people would deny him obedience? What envy would oppose itself to him? What Italian would refuse to follow him? This barbarian rule stinks in every nostril.
We have looked at Machiavelli the man, a politician, diplomat, and patriot deeply concerned about the survival of his country. Yet when we think of Machiavelli, or when we hear the adjective Machiavellian, something else leaps to mind. If a politician is described as Machiavellian, we imagine him to be cunning and ruthless in his quest for power, a man who uses deceit and guile to attain his goals. A Machiavellian, we might think, is amoral, a person without moral scruples. This has been a popular view of Machiavelli for many centuries. For example, the 16th century English playwright Christopher Marlowe, in his play Jew of Malta, has the character of Machiavelli deliver the prologue.
I am Machiavel, and weigh not men, and therefore not men's words. Admired I am of those that hate me most. Though some speak openly against my books, yet will they read me, and thereby attain to Peter's chair, and when they cast me off, are poisoned by my climbing followers. I count religion but a childish toy, and hold there is no sin but ignorance. Birds of the air will tell of murders past. I am ashamed to hear such fooleries. Many will talk of title to a crown. What right had Caesar to the empery? Might first made kings, and laws were then most sure when, like the Dracos, they were writ in blood.
In a similar vein, Shakespeare puts Machiavellian ideas in the dialogue of the Duke of Gloucester, later King Richard III. This is from Shakespeare's play Henry VI.
Why, I can smile, and murder whilst I smile, and cry content to that which grieves my heart, and wet my cheeks with artificial tears, and frame my face to all occasions. I'll drown more sailors than the mermaid shall. I'll slay more gazers than the basilisk. I'll play the orator as well as Nestor, deceive more slyly than Ulysses could, and like a Sinon take another Troy. I can add colors to the chameleon, change shapes with Proteus for advantages, and set the murderous Machiavel to school. Can I do this, and cannot get a crown? Tut, were it further off, I'll pluck it down.
One of the strongest denunciations of Machiavelli was by the 16th century Archbishop of Canterbury, Reginald Pole, who suggested that Machiavelli was the devil incarnate. As a young man, Pole admired Henry VIII and his minister Thomas Cromwell, but he later became their bitter foe. Cromwell recommended that Pole read The Prince to understand the practical side of politics. Here, according to Pole, is what Cromwell told him.
There is one book by a most acute modern author, who did not write about his own dreams as did Plato, who devised a plan for a republic which could not be put into practice, but had instead formulated maxims and observations of which daily experience confirmed the truth. And if I would give him permission and a promise to read that book, he would send it to me.
Reginald Pole read The Prince, and he was horrified.
Reading it, I found all the stratagems by means of which religion, justice, and goodwill were invalidated, and through which all human and divine virtues would become a prey of egoism, dissimulation, and falsehood. It was written by a certain Machiavelli, native of Florence, entitled The Prince, and it is such a work that if Satan himself had had a son for a successor, I don't know what other maxims he could pass on to him.
Modern scholars have some laughs at the expense of Pole and others who represent Machiavelli as a preacher of evil. Reliable scholarship, we are told, shows how ridiculous Pole was in his assessment of Machiavelli. Yet the same scholars who argue that we should understand Machiavelli in his historical context often fail to grant the same courtesy to Pole. As a learned Christian scholar, Pole believed political rulers should always hold justice as their ideal. Granted, this ideal was recognized more in the breach than in the observance, but it nevertheless remained an ideal in Christian political thought. Now, putting yourself in Pole's place, how would you react to passages like this from The Prince?
When the safety of one's country wholly depends on the decision to be taken, no attention should be paid either to justice or injustice, to kindness or cruelty, or to its being praiseworthy or ignominious. On the contrary, every other consideration being set aside, that alternative should be wholeheartedly adopted which will save the life and preserve the freedom of one's country.
Although Machiavelli as evil incarnate dominated the popular mind, other interpretations surfaced in the 17th and 18th centuries. Machiavelli, according to the English philosopher Francis Bacon, wrote The Prince to expose the nature of evil, thereby giving us knowledge to further the good.
We must be grateful to Machiavelli and to authors like him, who write about what men do and not about what they should do. It is not possible to join the wisdom of the serpent to the innocence of the dove. If we do not know all the characteristics of the serpent, his meanness, his dragging his belly, his slipperiness, his inconstancy, his malice, his poison, and all the rest, that is, all the forms and aspects of evil, because without this knowledge, virtue is vulnerable and defenseless.
The Dutch philosopher Spinoza, also writing in the 17th century, said The Prince is an exposé of rulers and a warning to avoid tyranny.
Perhaps Machiavelli wanted to show that a free people should by no means entrust their own safety to one man who, unless he is conceited and thinks he can please everyone, must fear traps set for him at all times.
This interpretation became popular in the 18th century. Rousseau echoed the belief that Machiavelli intended the prince as a warning against tyrants, but that this purpose had been overlooked by most readers.
Machiavelli pretended to instruct kings. Instead, he taught the people a magnificent lesson. The Prince is a book for republicans. The choice itself of his hateful hero, Caesar Borgia, shows clearly his secret intentions and explains the opposition of the maxims in his Prince to those in his discourses and in the Florentine histories. It is clear that this profound political writer has only had superficial and corrupted readers.
Notice that Rousseau mentions two other books by Machiavelli, including the Discourses. This refers to Machiavelli's book Discourses on the first 10 books of Titus Livy, which he wrote around the same time as The Prince. Livy, born in 59 BC, chronicled the history of Rome, and Machiavelli greatly admired this ancient work, looking to it for instruction on how republics can be preserved. Machiavelli's book Discourses on the first 10 books of Titus Livy explains why Rousseau and other commentators refused to believe that Machiavelli intended the prince seriously. How, they ask, could Machiavelli really favor rule by one person, as we find in The Prince, when in the Discourses he clearly favors a republican form of government? Indeed, Livy himself was a defender of the Roman Republic, a critic of Julius Caesar, and Machiavelli follows Livy in this respect. In his Discourses, Machiavelli condemns Julius Caesar and expresses his preference for the Roman Republic over the Roman Empire in no uncertain terms. What will an observer find, Machiavelli asks, when he examines the rule of Roman princes during the ancient republic?
What he will find when good princes were ruling is a prince securely reigning among subjects no less secure, a world replete with peace and justice. He will see the Senate's authority respected, the magistrates honored, rich citizens enjoying their wealth, nobility and virtue held in the highest esteem, and everything working smoothly and going well. He will notice, on the other hand, the absence of any rancor, any licentiousness, corruption, or ambition, and that in this golden age, everyone is free to hold and to defend his own opinion. He will behold, in short, the world triumphant, its prince glorious and respected by all, the people fond of him and secure under his rule.
Machiavelli contrasts this idyllic situation with the Roman Empire after Julius Caesar overthrew the Republic.
If he then looks attentively at the times of the other emperors, he will find them distraught with wars, torn by seditions, brutal alike in peace and in war, princes frequently killed by assassins, civil wars and foreign wars constantly occurring, Italy in travail and ever a prey to fresh misfortunes, its cities demolished and pillaged. He will see Rome burnt, its capital demolished by its own citizens, ancient temples lying desolate, religious rites grown corrupt, adultery rampant throughout the city. He will find the sea covered with exiles and the rocks stained with blood. He will thus happily learn how much Rome, Italy, and the world owed to Caesar.
Machiavelli is full of scorn for tyrants like Julius Caesar, and he admonishes rulers to shun the path of tyranny.
In conclusion, then, let those to whom the heavens grant such opportunities reflect that two courses are open to them. Either so to behave that in life they rest secure and in death become renowned, or so to behave that in life they are in continual straits and in death leave behind an imperishable record of their infamy.
When we consider how Machiavelli, in the Discourses, defends a republican form of government, where the people participate to some degree in the selection of rulers, we can understand why Rousseau did not accept The Prince at face value. And when we recall that Machiavelli served the Florentine government during its republican phase, opposing the Medicis as enemies of republicanism, we may wonder if Rousseau was right after all. But this would be a serious error. There is no conflict between the Discourses and The Prince because there are two basic kinds of government, according to Machiavelli, republics and principalities. And as he indicates in the opening of The Prince, Machiavelli examines these two kinds of government in two different books.
All the states, all the dominions under whose authority men have lived in the past and live now, have been and are either republics or principalities.
After dividing states into republics and principalities, Machiavelli expresses his intention to limit his discussion to principalities.
I shall leave out any discussion on republics, since I discussed them at length on another occasion. I shall deal only with a principality, and I shall debate how these principalities can be governed and maintained.
Although Machiavelli favors a republican form of government, he does so only under certain conditions. An important theme in Machiavelli's writing, as we shall see, is the need for rulers and states to adjust themselves to circumstances. Some conditions require a single prince to take control, and Machiavelli lists these conditions in his Discourses. For our purpose, the significant condition necessitating a prince is the initial establishment of a state, or the radical transformation of an existing state. Here is Machiavelli's comment.
One should take it as a general rule that rarely, if ever, does it happen that a state, whether it be a republic or a kingdom, is either well ordered at the outset or radically transformed vis-a-vis its old institutions, unless this be done by one person. It is likewise essential that there should be but one person upon whose mind and a method depends any similar process of organization. Wherefore the prudent organizer of a state, whose intention it is to govern not in his own interests, but for the common good, and not in the interest of his successors, but for the sake of that fatherland which is common to all, should contrive to be alone in his authority.
The founder of a state, Machiavelli goes on to argue, should do whatever is necessary to accomplish his goals. In passages like this, scattered throughout the Discourses, we see that Machiavelli holds the same views in the Discourses that he holds in The Prince.
Nor will any reasonable man blame a prince for taking any action, however extraordinary, which may be of service in the organizing of a kingdom or the constituting of a republic. It is a sound maxim that reprehensible actions may be justified by their effects, and that when the effect is good, it always justifies the action. For it is the man who uses violence to spoil things, not the man who uses it to mend them, that is blameworthy.
Machiavelli upholds rule by one person when it is necessary to establish or transform a state. This is the theme we find in The Prince. Machiavelli addresses the problems facing a new principality, such as when a prince conquers a new territory. And this is precisely what we would expect Machiavelli to discuss, since he wishes the Medici family to lead a divided Italy against foreign invaders. If the Medicis were to succeed in this enterprise, then, like the Borgias before them, they would have to conquer many independent states within Italy, thereby forming, in effect, a new principality. This is where an appreciation of Machiavelli's historical circumstances becomes extremely important. So before we delve into the major ideas expressed in The Prince, let's glance at Machiavelli's Italy, a crazy quilt of republics, duchies, and kingdoms. It is important to understand that Renaissance Italy was not a unified nation. There was no monarch or central government, and individuals thought of themselves as Florentines or as Venetians rather than as Italians. The five major powers in Italy were the Duchy of Milan and the Republic of Venice in the north, the Republic of Florence and the Papal States in central Italy, and the Kingdom of Naples in the south. There were conflicts and wars among these powers as they sought to expand their territories, but the Italian League of 1455 established a balance of powers that gave Italy a period of relative calm, at least by Renaissance standards, for 40 years. And it was during this time that Renaissance Italy approached the pinnacle of its cultural and artistic development. This rough balance of power came to an end in 1494 with the French invasion of Italy. A distinguished historian noted, "The history of this period is best told by a computer. So many and tangled are the treaties, negotiations, and battles that make up the basic chronology." We shall not attempt to unravel this tangle, but knowledge of a few events may help you appreciate its complexity. France had long-standing dynastic claims to the Kingdom of Naples in southern Italy and to the Duchy of Milan in northern Italy. The ambitious King of France, Charles VIII, believed the Kingdom of Naples was his rightful inheritance, while his brother-in-law and cousin, the French Duke of Orleans, laid claim to the Duchy of Milan. The idea of a French king claiming a good deal of southern Italy as his personal property, because centuries earlier the Pope supposedly gave it to his ancestors, may strike us as ludicrous today. But such assertions were commonplace during the Renaissance. Monarchs and princes had little difficulty finding a pretext for conquest, or anything else they could get away with. Even before the French invasion of 1494, Italian city-states had the nasty habit of appealing to France to gain advantages over their rival city-states. For example, in 1484, Venice was at war with Milan and Naples, so it suggested to France that the time was ripe to seize Naples or Milan, preferably both. Other city-states and various popes also made similar suggestions from time to time, but these did not have serious consequences until 1494. Charles VIII of France, a dwarfed and deformed lech, had visions of grandeur. He saw himself leading a crusade against the Turks. Now this is where things really get complicated. The Kingdom of Naples, Charles believed, belonged to him. The crown of Naples, it so happens, was joined to the crown of Sicily, and this carried with it the crown of Jerusalem. Thus, by conquering Naples and Sicily, Charles would be crowned Emperor of Jerusalem. Then he could launch his holy crusade against the infidels. Astute advisers of Charles had more realistic motives for urging him to invade Italy. Spain was a growing Mediterranean power, and a French base in Italy would serve to check this rival nation-state. Then there was the immense booty of Italy, a plum ripe for the picking, no small consideration to be sure among the French nobles, who saw their power waning at home. Finally, there is the natural tendency for advisers to tell rulers what they want to hear. If Charles was known to have his sights set on Naples, what adviser would argue otherwise? Sir Thomas More, in his book Utopia, satirized this tendency 20 years later. A main character in Utopia imagines the cold reception his advice would receive in the French king's court, and he says the following to More.
They beat their brains and search the very bottom of their wits to discuss by what craft and means the king may still keep Milan, and draw to him again fugitive Naples. If I, silly man, should rise up and will them to turn over the leaf, to learn a new lesson, saying that my counsel is not to meddle with Italy, but to tarry still at home, and that the kingdom of France alone is almost greater than that it may well be governed of one man. Furthermore, if I should declare unto them that all this busy preparance to war, whereby so many nations for his sake should be brought into a troublesome hurly-burly, when all his coffers were emptied, his treasures wasted, and his people destroyed, should at the length, through some mischance, be in vain and to none effect, and that therefore it were best for him to content himself with his own kingdom of France. This mine advice, Master More. How think you it would be heard and taken? So God help me, not very thankfully, quoth I.
If Charles needed encouragement to invade Italy, he got it from the unscrupulous Ludovico Sforza, ruler of Milan and consummate politician. Ludovico was the uncle of the young Duke of Milan, and Ludovico was supposed to rule Milan as regent until the Duke reached maturity in 1490. Well, 1490 came and went, but Ludovico didn't seem to notice, and neither, for that matter, did the lazy young Duke, who was content with his dogs, horses, and good food. But if the Duke didn't notice, his ambitious wife did. In fact, she complained to her grandfather, the King of Naples. The old king promised to do something. Ludovico beat him to the punch. What better time for Charles, the French king, to conquer Naples, thereby removing the threat to Ludovico's rule over Milan? With Ludovico's assurance that the French could pass unhindered through northern Italy, Charles could march south and conquer Naples, his rightful domain. Of course, there was the small matter of Milan itself, claimed by the Duke of Orleans. With luck, Charles would overlook this thorny problem and leave Milan securely in Ludovico's hands. And this is indeed what happened, for a while at least. Meanwhile, the legitimate Duke of Milan, the lover of animals and food, soon died of a mysterious illness which doctors could not diagnose, but which rumor attributed to poison. More than one Italian prince contracted this mysterious disease. When King Charles died in 1498, the poor fellow struck his head on a door while playing games in his chateau. Ludovico's luck ran out as well. The next French king, Louis XII, was none other than the Duke of Orleans, the same duke who lusted for Milan. During his coronation, Louis assumed the titles of King of Naples and Sicily, Emperor of Jerusalem, and of course, Duke of Milan. Clearly, Ludovico was in trouble. The French took Milan easily. When Ludovico hired Swiss mercenaries to recapture it, the French sent their Swiss mercenaries to meet him. Ludovico's Swiss soldiers refused to fight their countrymen. Then they demanded their back pay. Ludovico, disguising himself, tried to hide from the French in the ranks of his mercenaries. Discovered and taken to France, he ended his days in a dungeon, reading Dante and scratching quaint drawings on the walls. If the machinations of Renaissance rulers sometimes reached comical dimensions, the same cannot be said for the effects of their policies. The rulers jockeyed for power, played their princely games of war, and as usual, the common people died. The repulsive Charles VIII may have looked comical astride his majestic black steed, causing the cheering citizens of Florence to lapse into stunned silence upon first seeing him. But there was nothing comical about the 30,000 crack soldiers who trailed behind, cavalry, archers, crossbowmen, and above all, Swiss mercenaries, the most feared infantry of their day, who could decimate armies or repel cavalry charges with their long pikes and dense formations. France developed the first standing army of modern times, and it was an army to be reckoned with. Italy had never seen its like. When Charles invaded in 1494, his army marched through Italy with surprising ease, crushing what little resistance it found. Mobile French artillery demolished Italian fortresses so rapidly that the French invasion was described by Machiavelli as executed with chalk in hand, meaning the French merely had to mark on their map the route they wished to follow. Italy, accustomed to a slower, less destructive warfare, would never be the same again. As Guicciardini put it in his History of Italy, the French invasion changed the art of war.
Before, nearly all of Italy had been divided among 5 states: the Papacy, Naples, Venice, Milan, and Florence. Each tried to preserve its possessions. Each was concerned that no one should occupy anyone else's territory or grow strong enough for the others to fear. For that reason, attention was paid to every slight movement, and a fuss was raised even when only some tiny castle was at stake. When war did break out, the sides were so evenly balanced, the methods of warfare so slow, and the artillery so inefficient that it took nearly a whole summer to take a castle. Wars were very long. Battles ended with few or no deaths.
The new warfare, Guicciardini observed, was vastly different.
Now wars were sudden and violent. Entire kingdoms were conquered and captured in less time than it used to take to conquer a village. Sieges were successfully carried out not in months, but in days or hours. Battles were fierce and bloody. And finally, states were maintained, ruined, given and taken away not by plans drawn up in a study, as used to be the case, but in the field by force of arms.
This is the end of Side 1. Please fast forward and begin Side 2.